Regardless of anyone's religion, this is an important topic because you really can't explain 20th century Scarsdale without talking about this massive demographic shift that happened. Then just on a personal level, so I was born Jewish and raised Jewish. I'm not observant. But this presentation, which I've been working on for over a year, has been very impactful to me, feeling surprisingly so, feeling very sort of connected with all of the people who came before. Um, it's been a really great perspective. In 586, the first temple in Jerusalem is destroyed by the Babylonians. A bunch of the Israelites are brought over to Babylon with modern-day Iraq, come back a couple decades later under Persian rule and rebuild the temple. In 70 CC, the Romans come in and destroy the second temple, and that's when things change a lot here. And many Jews stay in that area, and other Jews go into diaspora. Okay, so you're going to come along North Africa, going to come along Roman trade routes and up into Europe over the coming centuries. Over here in the Iberian Peninsula, the Jews that settled here were later named Sephardic Jews, Sephardic meaning Spain. And then you have, going into southern Europe, you had what turned into the Ashkenazi Jews. Ashkenazi Jews are a mix of Levant DNA and basically Southern European DNA. So I'm not saying you're half Italian, but you might be half Italian. They wound up here in Southern Europe and then moved up into the Rhineland. So that's up into modern day Germany. That's where you had the sort of the marriage between German language and Hebrew words, added a little bit of Slavic later, but that's where Yiddish started up in this area here. And then you have Jewish communities established here, and then you have, starting around 1000, you have a bunch of expulsions and things like that. You have Jews being expelled, again, not all, but many out of England, out of France. The First Crusade in 1096 brings a lot of trouble, and though the communities persisted. And in 1492, after the Christians finally pushed the Muslims out of Spain, and that was a more hospitable under the Muslims, some of the Sephardic Jews go and join and change a lot of the Mizrahi communities in this area here. So then you have a trickle going across the Atlantic, and then you have this significant movement over here. So this is a very, very significant movement where you have Jewish people migrating east, and you're going into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was a welcoming place for Jews at that time. It became the largest center of Jewish population in the world. It became a major hub for communal and religious life. If you've ever had conversations with your grandparents about where did you come from, and you get like 3 countries listed, this is why. So before 1790, things are going pretty well. You have a relatively welcoming rule. Jewish life is secure and flourishing in Poland, Lithuania. Then in the late 1700s, the Commonwealth is partitioned. It gets carved up by its neighbors. And the Jewish parts, you can see, are annexed by the Russian Empire, and things take a turn for the worse. Much less tolerant rule. In 1791, Russia establishes the Pale of Settlement. Pale is the word for means boundary or limit, meaning it prescribed where Jews could live and where they couldn't live. And then that extended to further restrictions on what Jews could and couldn't do there. So these borders have changed a lot. Then the modern view would be basically you're talking Eastern Poland, you're talking Western Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, a little bit of Moldova here, a little bit just skirting this area here. So if your family came before 1917 and the collapse of the Russian Empire, on the census form or on the immigration form, it would just say Russia, because that's what it was, Russia, but later they would say that was actually Poland, it was actually Lithuania. Jews faced restrictions on owning and farming land, so pushed many into shtetl. So this is a shtetl, this is Ukraine, Tarash in Ukraine. Shtetl was typically a small market town, typically with a large Jewish population. So this is the roof of the big synagogue in town back here. And it's, market town, so there's something on this wagon. I can't tell if these are cloths or hides or what, but this would have been for trading and so on. Most Jews then would have been poor or sometimes middle class. Life would have centered on a very communal, traditional, and religious existence, strong charity networks, spoken Yiddish. Jews had limited access to the civil service, to military officer ranks, many professions, often through quotas and restrictions. So the common occupations then would be artisan, craftsmen, so like a tailor, shoemaker, carpenter, blacksmith, as well as merchants and traders, shopkeepers, peddlers, wholesalers. It's all about and then money lending was not nearly as prevalent. You can imagine there are not a lot of money lenders here. It was not that common a thing as is sort of described in popular portrayals. And then in the late 1800s, industrial labor started to emerge. So backing up for a second, just to go across the Atlantic to New York, Jews had been trickling into New York since the mid 1600s. New York City was a relatively hospitable place for Jews. It was different. New York, the colony of New York, was different than other colonies because it had been taken from the Dutch. And the Dutch were all about business. They weren't about enforcing religious conformity. It's not Puritans, it's about trade. So the British take it over. They avoid messing with the system to keep things stable. So as a result, New York was one of the most religiously tolerant and diverse colonies always. In the 1800s, from about 1820 to about 1880, significant numbers of Jews immigrated from German-speaking lands. So this is what you would call German Jews. There was legal restrictions. There were guild restrictions in Germany. They were worried about military conscription. There was political upheaval, 1848. So Jews are coming out. They're coming to New York. And the German Jews hit the ground running in New York because they arrived with urban and commercial backgrounds. So I'm taking you back here to the Pale. In 1881, there's a wave of violent pogroms that go across the Pale, surge through after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. There's further outbreaks, and a huge number of Jews from the Pale leave. And you can see some go to various places. And obviously, and if I haven't said so, Jews have been all over the world, right? India and China and things like that. I'm focusing on the Jews that kind of their descendants wound up in the New York area. There were a lot of structural pressures. Russia's tightening down. The community is getting poorer. The community is getting overcrowded. And there needs to be some sort of release, fear of military conscription winding up in the Tsar's army. Over 2 million Jews leave, and the vast majority of them, you can see here, wind up in North America. That was because at that time, the United States had relatively open immigration, it had a strong economy, legal equality, and then once you have the first bunch of Jews settling there, you have networks that can help you find a job and housing and support and so on. So a lot of them, the Jews that came, they wind up in New York City first, and a lot of them stayed there. Of course, the Jews wind up all over the United States. And just so you can see this incredible growth here, the yellow line is the percentage of New York City's population. So it was in the single digits, the low single digits, about 2% all along. The blue line is the total Jewish population of New York City. So you can see from 1700, minimal number through 1800s. 1800s, you start to see German Jews coming in here, which it's not a small number, but New York City was a big place. And then boom, 1881, massive, massive growth. Jews wind up making up almost 30% of New York City, which is an extraordinarily high amount. The backgrounds from the Pale of the trading and the crafts and the artisanship puts Jews right into the economy of New York. Many of them found work in urban industries, namely the garment business, either doing piecework at home or going into sweatshops and working there. So this is kind of what it would have looked like. This is Ludlow Street. This is a Jacob Riis. He documented urban poverty. This is his photo. So these are destitute European Jews working at the entry level of the garment industry. I had a discussion with my sister about whether traditional Jews had dogs, and apparently they do. And then the end that I show over here, actually, this drops precipitously over here. There's something called the Immigration Act of 1924, which is really a mind-boggling thing. That was Before then, European immigration was largely, if you were healthy and you had somebody to sort of vouch for you, you were in. Uh, this capped it, and what it was essentially looking to do was unwind all of the immigration from the past 3 decades and sort of restore the ethnic balance of the United States. Because you had Eastern Europeans coming in, and you'd have Southern Europeans, a lot of Italians coming in during that time. So a law was passed to cap immigration at 2% of every country of origin. But the crazy thing is that they didn't use the census of 1920. They used the census of 1890. In other words, rewinding before all of these recent immigrants came here to say, we're going to make it like that. So that immediately, just by the book, that cuts Jewish immigration down by 90%. But then they didn't really issue visas. So Jewish immigration really stopped. It was cut from 100,000 a year to probably 5,000 a year or less. Then during the 30s, it was also curtailed. So that really accounts for there's kind of stopping on a dime there. Many Jewish immigrant families experienced significant upward mobility. These are Jewish Columbia University students in the early part of the century. Jews moved very quickly from destitution, from complete poverty on the Lower East Side, to middle-class-ish urban existence in the Bronx or Brooklyn, then out to the suburbs, sometimes in 3 generations, which is pretty quick for a newly arrived immigrant group. So Jews had a shorter period of economic struggle in America than many other immigrant groups. And there's really 2 factors that can affect how quickly your group develops in America. And again, I'm not talking about everybody. There's obviously poor people and wealthy people and different rates of progression. But there's really two factors. One is going to be how society treats you, right? What limits does society put, formally or informally, on your ability to progress? That's one. The other one is what internal characteristics of your culture, based on your history, do you have that fit into the environment that cause you to be able to succeed at a faster or slower rate? And I'm not saying, obviously, I think everybody has the same potential. They're going to get to the same place. I'm talking about how quickly. One explanation for that was that the economic conditions in the Pale led to Jews being ready to go. You couldn't farm, and you were sort of shunted off into more artisan and collaborative networks because things were so poor. You had strong communities. You had to support each other, and you also had widespread male literacy from religious instruction there. And so that's been described as something that helped Jewish immigrants adapt very quickly to urban, commercial, and industrial environments in New York City. That doesn't really explain it because Jews who were never in the Pale, German Jews, Sephardic Jews, also had the same education, the same high rates of literacy, and so on. So if you look a little bit earlier, this is a sort of a scholarly thing, and then I'm going to hop to Scarsdale. But this is the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70, which totally changed the Jewish religion and the people. What religious practice had been in Jerusalem was it was centered with the Kohanim, the priests, right? And a lot of centered on animal sacrifice. You'd bring your animal and they would take care of it. It was very, very centralized religion. So after this happens and Jews go out into diaspora, the religion gets pushed down. Inherited priests having less of a role, and now you have rabbis having a role. And rabbis get their position not by inheriting it, but by earning the respect of the community through scholarship. And then you also get the religion pushed down into the household. So think this time of year, think of Passover, right? The symbolism of what's on the plate, the burnt shank bone and things like that, those are all going back to this era. So these are things that were done before 2,000 years ago, but you get pushed down into the community, pushed down into the household. Now there's a expectation, desire that Jewish fathers teach their sons to read. Once you hit New York City, 2,000 years later, your culture is sort of ready to go. That the time that you spent on scholarship and so on means that you might be working in a sweatshop, but your kid might go to college. And that it happens to be a little bit quicker. This is the basic outline that I've constructed. First 3 centuries, there's no known Jews in Scarsdale. I'll explain why. First 50 years of the 20th century, you have increasing Jewish presence in some neighborhoods. You have limited civic participation and parallel social institutions. Post-war, we have large increases in Scarsdale's Jewish population and progress towards civic and social integration. Then 1970 until now, Scarsdale's population, Jewish population, levels off, and Jews become mainstream and established in the community leadership. I changed this from no Jews allowed. It's not no Jews allowed. It's no Jews around. Nobody was keeping anybody out. In Westchester, there was a tiny, in the 1600s, the 1700s, a tiny presence. Again, there's a mismatch between what, at this point, it would have been more German Jews, perhaps Sephardic Jews, what they're doing, trading and so on. And Westchester was so sparse, you really wouldn't have many people. So this was just one of the very few Jews who lived in Westchester. Moses Levy of Rye. You can see from the background, he was a merchant. There's nothing in this portrait that would show him as Jewish. Just a few families, no organized community. By the late 1700s, a lot of them moved away. None of them ever lived in Scarsdale that we can tell. For most of the 19th century, Westchester County, again, too sparsely populated and agrarian to support significant Jewish commercial or professional communities. You might see some peddlers operating on the waterfront, but that really was about it. In the late 1800s, you get a couple of developments. You get Jewish communities starting to form in places with industry. So we're talking like Yonkers, Mount Vernon, New Rochelle. Up here, we've got Peekskill and Ossining, Tarrytown over here in Portchester. So by the water, you might see some, not internally here in Scarsdale. Then a small number of wealthy German people had estates put up. Samuel Untermeyer in Yonkers, Nathan Strauss in Mamaroneck, Felix Warburg in Greenberg. And this is Scarsdale. It's very sparse. This is 1851. This is all the streets that were there at that time. So this isn't like just the main streets. So there's, like 6 streets or something like that in town. It's pretty much all farming. There's no demand for urban trades. There's no business center or anything like that. So Scarsdale wasn't closed to Jews or closed to German Jews. It was just a mismatch. It was not the environment. Late in the century, Eastern European Jews start coming in, but they're on the Lower East Side, working at home, working in sweatshops. They're not coming up to work on farms. So 1900, I have Jews politely tolerated. Scarsdale's population in 1900 is 900 people. It's about 18,000 today. So it's just starting to suburbanize. Scarsdale suburbanized later than other places being internally. This is the first Jewish family that I can find in Scarsdale. I think I'm probably right, but I'll never say that I can prove a negative. But I've done a pretty exhaustive search. So this is Samuel and Fanny Rosef. I can't find a picture of Fanny, but this is Samuel. They had 4 kids. They lived in Quaker Ridge, next door to the Griffin Avenue Schoolhouse, which is now the Caddy Shack on the grounds of Quaker Ridge Golf Course, District 2. They were actually both born in Russia, although in one census it says he was born in Germany. Make of that what you will. He came to the US as a child or a teen. We know that they were in Scarsdale in 1900. I have one source that says they came earlier, but I'm not convinced. He was a manufacturer, perhaps in clocks. Then he became a successful builder. He built this building in Manhattan, among others. So he really had it going on. And the Rossifs are involved in the school. So in the Inquirer, then you can see that the kids had 100% attendance in some months. They got prizes for academic performance. 1904, the Arbor Day exercises were held Friday, May 13th at 2 o'clock. The program was well given. After the closing song, the children were given a treat of cake by Mrs. Samuel Rossif and of candy by their teacher. So she's like a PTA coming into school. And then there's a funny thing that's going to appear a little bit during this. This is the Scarsdale District 2, so that's the Quaker Ridge Christmas program over here. And you have, Rosalie Rossef in the singing and the recitation of Christmas Dilemma. Rosalie Rossef recites that as well. And Little Blue Eyes and His Christmas is recited by Dora Rossef. So there's this idea then maybe now as well, that Christmas is for everyone. And that was just sort of how it went. I mean, I think I remember even in the 70s or 80s having like Christmas things in your school. It was like, it was just different times. They're still in Scarsdale in 1910. By 1915, they've moved to Mount Vernon. He's joined a synagogue there. I couldn't say whether they moved because they wanted to be closer to a Jewish community, because Mount Vernon would have been a much more Jewish place that had a congregation earlier, or he might have been wanted to be closer to New York City or closer to his real estate projects. So I can't say why they left. But this is the first as far as I can tell. So other Jews start coming to Scarsdale, and you get this kind of first wave of Jewish civic leaders. The couple that I want to talk about is Max and Judith Hayes Goldsmith. Max Goldsmith, and he's depicted here in the middle. He's one of Scarsdale's first prominent Jewish residents. He's born 1870s in Germany. The original name is Goldschmidt, becomes Goldsmith when you come here. He was an exporter. He comes to Scarsdale in 1915, lives on a large Drake Road estate named Upland Farm. And you can see here, like Scarsdale residents abroad, they're being certainly included in things. This is the Inquirer, and when they go to Europe, when he goes, this is Max, this is his son Bernard, this is his son's friend, the most Gentile name ever, Fairfield Dana. So they spend the summer traveling in Europe. Max comes home earlier. The two boys fly from Zurich to London. They go to Boulogne tomorrow. He climbed the Matterhorn. He was critically one of the original directors of the Scarsdale National Bank. So there was a 1920 meeting to organize the bank, and he organized it, and it was held at his home. Attendees included some names you might recognize: George Harwood of the Harwood Building, George Field of the George Field Park, and Rush Wilson of Scarsdale Improvement, the original. The bank later made loans to create Scarsdale's downtown, as well as all sorts of stuff around town. He was a trustee of the Scarsdale Foundation from its founding in 1923. Very respected, very involved. Judith Hayes Goldsmith, she was of an old, prominent Westchester Jewish family in Rye. She helped found the Scarsdale Women's Club. They raised children in Scarsdale, 4 of them. They hosted community events. Very, very involved in things. Another couple were Sigmund and Irma Stein. They were German Jews, moved to Scarsdale in 1916. Sigmund was the head of a family garment firm, and he joined the exclusive town club, which was basically the shadow legislature for Scarsdale, and very, very exclusive. Irma, who's pictured here years later, up on the upper right, she joined the Scarsdale Women's Club. She was a founding member of the Scarsdale League of Women Voters, which was always a more inclusive group in town. She was a member of the Scarsdale Garden Club. You can see her garden here at her house on 25 Eaton. They hosted civic events. And you start to see a pattern of working alongside Christians or non-Jews in your civic life and socializing with other Jews on the weekends. So they were members of Sunningdale, and that's the pattern sort of for the first half of the century, that you are accepted in some way in some parts of town, but there's not a complete integration between what people are doing. This is an adorable picture here from 1949. We've got Irma, we've got her sister, and we've got her mother, who is celebrating her 86th birthday by taking her first airplane ride to Washington, D.C. with her 2 daughters. And her quote is, "I'm going on a lark." They're both really significant in town because in 1921, their 7-year-old son asks them why he doesn't go to Sunday school like his friends do. And so he goes to Green Acres Elementary. So Irma and a friend go down to the city. They consult with Rabbi Stephen Wise, and they start a Jewish Sunday school in their home on Eaton Road. And as enrollment grows, they host it in other homes of other people. And then when the classes outgrew the private homes, they rented commercial space in White Plains. It wasn't that they couldn't get space in Scarsdale because nobody would let them. There wasn't any. There was no downtown at that point. So the only commercial space would have been in White Plains that you could rent. Plus, that's very close to Green Acres, closer than downtown, even if you could have gotten space there. So interestingly, the parents wanted only a school. that was the goal. They weren't looking to set up a congregation. Rabbi Wise told them that their kids wouldn't respect Judaism unless they saw that their parents observing it as well, and so that's it. Kind of backdoored in through that. Uh, a brief diversion. The related joke to that, like Borscht Belt joke, is Rabbi has mice in his synagogue, and he's tried everything to get rid of them. He can't do it. Traps, exterminator. Goes to the rabbi in the next town, says, "I've got mice in my synagogue. What can I do?" He said, "I got it. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to sew little yarmulkes for them. You're going to make little taluses. You're going to bring them all up to the bima. You're going to bar mitzvah all of them. You'll never see them again." So this is very cute. This is in the Inquirer. The Inquirer is explaining Hanukkah to the readers. So what the congregation that they formed was the Jewish Community Center of White Plains, which now is known as Kol Ami. So that was the first congregation that Scarsdale residents probably would have been going to. The only one that was really, really close enough to go at that point. This was the first temple building. You might recognize this. We are looking southwest from White Plains into Green Acres. This is Post Road where it splits into Maple. There's a gas station there, and this is a Salvation Army building. So as you're going up towards White Plains, you'll see it on the left, Salvation Army. This was the original home of Kol Ami, then called the Jewish Community Center of White Plains. Reform orientation, highly assimilationist. The services were largely in English. Rabbis were referred to as a doctor. Rosh Hashanah was called New Year's. Yom Kippur was called Day of Atonement. And it became more traditional over time. Because, again, these were German Jews who would have been more assimilationist from the beginning. And again, also, they only formed the congregation sort of in the back door. Early membership was roughly split between Scarsdale and White Plains. They had it mostly in Green Acres and Fox Meadow in the 30s, about 80 Jewish families. In 1948, they moved to Soundview Avenue, Kol Ami did, because they had huge membership growth. They would have to have their high holidays in the Westchester County Center. So for 30 years, though, this was the principal reform institution for Scarsdale Jews. They changed the name in 1994 because the YMHA and YWHA changed their name to the JCC. So they changed their name to Kol Ami, which means voice of my people. So in the early 20th century, you start to have improved rail and road transportation, and now it makes commuting from Westchester possible in a way that it really wasn't before. Scarsdale and Westchester have a growing professional class, nice homes, improving schools. So this also has appeal to upwardly mobile Jewish families as well. I want to just discuss the movement into the suburbs. There's a broader context of social barriers that is not at all unique to Scarsdale. So the least restrictive places in the US for Jews would have been these dense urban immigrant neighborhoods. But this is what these professionals were looking to get out of. They wanted what everybody else wants, a little bit more space and so on. Then you have the suburban and the commuter communities in the Northeast. They're more restrictive, particularly those that are more status or image conscious, more affluent. So there's two types of practices that contribute to the limit of Jews. The first one is restrictive deed covenants. So deed covenants don't have to be race or religion based. So Scarsdale had them going back to 1891 Arthur Manor, but not for race or religion. It was so that way you wouldn't create a tavern or a factory in a residential neighborhood. So it's basically just a collective agreement, keeps the values up, keeps the neighborhood nice. But race-based covenants or ethnicity-based covenants started to come in the late 20s, and they were legally enforceable until 1948. So you could say, on this deed, you cannot sell to a black person, you cannot sell to a Jewish person. Then you also had informal exclusion, also known as gentlemen's agreements, where basically the realtors and they just wouldn't sell. We're just going to keep this place, as it is. So it's a social pressure. So I really don't mean to be busting on Bronxville because it has the most well-documented history of this because it was a planned community. So it was a planned community by William Van Duzer Lawrence in the late 1800s. And the whole thing, he created the community, he endowed Lawrence Hospital, Sarah Lawrence College. So it's really kind of one guy creating this. So we've got this thing from 1925, this article. I live in Bronxville. Restrictions, yes. Bronxville has been carefully guarded in its development, but not in the sense the word usually calls to mind. The index of desirability has always been character, culture, and ability to fit easily and naturally into the social scheme. But by contrast, Scarsdale was not one planned community. Because it was underdeveloped, it was developed more piecemeal, and that gave Jews a toehold to get in, that it wasn't this sort of, you didn't have a lot of people living there already as gatekeepers. So this is interesting. So Jewish families often rented homes in Scarsdale before coming up. People who lived here would go up and then they would rent their house out for the summer. So you see, this is from the Hebrew Standard, the Reform Advocate. So these are English language Jewish newspapers occupying a circle on Cottage Road for the summer. These folks' house for the summer here. Julius Oppenheimer on Heathcote Road, taking over someone's Heathcote Road house for the summer. And then you have people who are living here, the Waldmans, Hasterlichs are visiting their children, Milton Stein in Scarsdale, tending to be German Jews at this point. The Eastern European Jews aren't quite on their feet in general at this point yet. There's excitement over Al Jolson, born Asa Yolson in Kaunas, Russia, Lithuania. So basically it's near where my great-grandfather came from. Came to New York at age 8. He's here with his father, cantor and Rabbi Moses Reuben Yolson. And the newspaper is ecstatic about him coming. Everybody's excited to have, the greatest entertainer coming to town. But this is what changed everything about Jews being able to come to Scarsdale. So in 1924, the massive 360-acre Fox Meadow estate that had been owned by the Butler family since the 1860s went up for sale. And it was sold to Everett and I. Randolph Jacobs, who were two Jewish brothers who worked and lived together. They developed the land, very, very nice, and they sell off lots through their broker, Myron Blum, also Jewish, to Jews and non-Jews alike. So that's how Fox Meadow becomes the sort of real anchor of the Jewish community in Scarsdale. This made Scarsdale uniquely attainable for Jews in Westchester compared to surrounding towns, for sure. And again, with wealth, some amount of wealth as a limiter. Then, as Jews settle there, you have a critical mass, and more Jews know that this is an area to come to. Part of the reason that this is so helpful when you have areas opened up is there's nobody living there to complain about it, right? There's nobody saying my property values or my culture or whatever it is that the complaint is going to be, right? So you open up the land, Jews can buy, non-Jews can buy. If you're a non-Jew and you buy in, you're getting what you expect, right? You're not being surprised by changes or something like that. So it's just you're going to accept it, and maybe you are already of a disposition where you do accept it, and you're totally fine with it. This pattern replicated after World War II with Quaker Ridge. Quaker Ridge was undeveloped, and then as that was developed, you had a sort of, again, a clean slate for people to come in. You could also buy your way into areas of Scarsdale much more easily than the more modest areas. So this is the residence of Harry Rosenthal on 28 Garden Road. He was in the women's shoe business. Beautiful, beautiful big house, large gardens. The more modest areas are more built up, so they're harder to get into. I can't tell you the other reason that they tend to be more inhospitable. You're closer to your neighbors. It could be maybe just money talks louder. So I was looking in the National Library of Israel in Yiddish newspapers, and I found a couple of ads from 1928. So this is Scarsdale, 11,500, beautiful single-family home with fine bath in the best part of Scarsdale, immediate occupancy in green surroundings. This is real estate for sale, all Yiddish. Scarsdale, house costs $35,000, 9 rooms, 3 baths, oil furnace, 3-car garage, small garden. This is surprising to me because I don't think of Yiddish speakers as settling in Scarsdale. It was definitely much more assimilated Jews. Yiddish newspapers were created and read by Eastern European immigrants on the Lower East Side. So they generally weren't read by German Jews in general because they didn't speak Yiddish at that point. I suspect these ads were completely unsuccessful because there's just a couple of them. There's not much. So, but It actually does tell you something very important. So these real estate agents were not Jewish themselves. So this does not say that Yiddish-speaking people were moving to Scarsdale. What it does say is it does say that real estate agents did not fear ostracization by selling to a Jew. They were advertising for Jewish people to come up. So in other words, there was no village-wide gentleman's agreement. You're advertising and you're trying to drum up business, wherever you can. And he's right on East Parkway. He's selling to everybody in this town. He was certainly selling to more non-Jews than Jews in this time. That said, I don't want to overstate it. There were a couple parts of town that did have restrictive covenants. The first one was Crane Berkeley. It was created in 1929, 1930 by Alexander Crane. He was a major landowner. He was a former town supervisor. And it was created as a restricted subdivision to enhance its exclusive status. But interestingly, Jews still rented homes there for the summer. You just couldn't buy one. Berkeley also offers plots of ample dimensions which will be sold subject to restrictive covenants designed to ensure the maintenance of the high character of this residential park. That can mean a few things, but they didn't sell to Jews. That much is clear. Then there's also a deep irony in what happened in that, if you recall, Max Goldsmith and his upland farm on Drake Road. So after he died, his estate was subdivided by Walter Collette, big builder around town, in 1939 as Sherbrooke Park, and that included restrictions barring the sale of homes to Jews. As long as we're talking about patterns of exclusion, in the late 19th century, when waves of Eastern European Jews come to the US, anti-Jewish bias took the form of either hostility or discomfort or whatever one you call it towards poor immigrants with different customs and language and so on. So you're sort of looking down, and this is not something that changes. This is kind of a American thing. You kind of recent immigrants tend to get that sort of treatment. In the early 20th century, though, it changed as Jews get to more success. The anti-Jewish bias changes from sort of looking down to looking across and defending traditional Protestant institutions. Right? And Jews are coming in, like the picture of the Jewish kids at Columbia. You're protecting because you've got a lot of Jews coming in and you kind of want to tamp it down. So that you might see that you see that in all sorts of things. In Columbia, interestingly, in 1918, it was about a third Jewish. It's an astounding amount, very, very high. The reason for that was that in order to get in there, you just had an entrance exam. So if you were smart and if you were a good student, you could sit for that exam and you could get into Columbia. The reaction to that in Columbia and other schools was either the hard quotas or it would be softer things, other things in your application, extracurriculars, interviews, all sorts of subjective things that you would use to try to keep the people coming in who your alumni wanted to come in and avoid having your school change very quickly demographically. That was a lot of schools, not all schools. City College, no. MIT, Cooper Union, they always just took the best. So in business, investment banking firms, Jews would be excluded from that, have to start their own. Parts of law, that was the same thing. And it was also evident in clubs, leisure, social things, including resorts, hotels, fraternities, and country clubs. So it may be well known to you, the Jews were excluded from Scarsdale Golf Club. That's the one that was held up. It's extremely diverse today. It's not an issue, but at one point it was a pretty firm policy. That, of course, though, not particular to Scarsdale, that mirrors broader national patterns. So the response to that is Jews set up parallel institutions, right? So you can't get in, but you're not going to just lump it. So Scarsdale Golf Club is set up in 1916. Sunningdale moves over. So you still have the same opportunity for business networking, social connection, and things like that, recreation. You still have everything available to you. It's just it's your own institution. Interestingly, about Quaker Ridge, just to give you a little perspective on that, That was set up for German Jews, mainly in New York City. So you get people like Nathan Strauss of Macy's, George Gershwin, Louis Gimbel, Samuel Bloomingdale, Alfred Knopf. They did not accept Eastern European or Sephardic Jews. So everybody needs to kind of put themselves above, you know. Obviously, that's changed. Otherwise, they would have been out of business. This is the one issue that when I would talk about doing this topic, this is the topic that a lot of people jump right to, the clubs. And I just want to sort of say that the clubs take up an awful lot of bandwidth when you talk about whether it's discrimination or belonging, in part because because you have a First Amendment right of association on a private club, they kept their discrimination going a lot longer than schools and businesses and things like that did. Also, it's very stark. You might not know why you didn't get a job or why you didn't get a house, but the clubs have a firm rule. You know exactly why you didn't get in. There was a Morton Goldsmith, unrelated to Max Goldsmith. He was a Harvard graduate, Scarsdale resident from 1921. He went to a meeting of the New York Harvard Club at Scarsdale Golf Club, and the Scarsdale Golf Club informed the Harvard Club that they would be denied future use of the premises if it allowed Jewish guests. So it's very, very hard. So it's very stark. But I just want to say that focusing so much on the clubs, it obscures other areas where there's integration, where there's inclusion. So just take it for what it's worth. The clubs were like this, but that doesn't mean that Jews didn't build successful professional and social lives without belonging to that particular club. Still on this topic, though, this is the town club, massive, like shadow legislature of Scarsdale. Mr. Gallagher, this is the Committee on Hebrews. Scarsdale in 1925 is about 10% Jewish. Mr. Gallagher for the membership committee asked for instructions in regard to recommending Hebrews for election, whether to have a limit of 5 or 10% of the membership, or what would be the board's policy. Quite a discussion followed. And as you know from the other folks we've talked about, there were obviously Jewish members in it already. It was finally decided not to take action, but let the membership committee act as they saw fit, in either recommending or not to the board as the names came up, and then the board would be the final judge whether to elect or not hold the men over. Let the policy of the membership committee and board be conservative. What's clear is, A, they didn't put a quota in, right? And the other thing that I'll just point out, of course, is this is 50 years before the first woman was admitted to the town club, to put, again, more in perspective. So I'll talk about a couple of the first people involved in Scarsdale governance. Pre-war, there was very, very limited Jewish representation. The vast majority, about 90%, were Protestant. Almost the next 10% were Catholic. Then there was Jacob Aronson. He was born in 1887 in Brooklyn. In 1931, he lived on Tunstall Road. And then he later lived on 16 Chesterfield Road. He was the general counsel, head of the legal division at the New York Central Railroad. So definitely like a big shot, big shot. He was exactly the sort of person who was sort of like undeniable. His credentials, like, so he was on the board of governors of the town club, so not just a member. He was board of trustees of the JCC of White Plains, associated with the Scarsdale National Bank, member of Quaker Ridge Golf Club. He was a Mason. And then on the right, we have George Ernst. He was a Wall Street lawyer. He was in the town club since 1927. In 1933, he was nominated to be town supervisor, and he was unsuccessful, not because he was Jewish, but because he was a Democrat. So there's going to be more on that later. But anyway, so there was a nonpartisan committee that nominated him to the school board. And in 1936, he became the first Jewish resident elected. In 1939, after his first term, he was not renominated by the committee, perhaps seen as too liberal. So what was really notable about that to me is not that action, it's the community's response. So what happened? The man who was nominated in his place was apoplectic. He had no idea that he was selected over a qualified incumbent who was doing a good job and wanted to continue. So he immediately withdrew his name. And then the town rallied around him. He came forward, ran on an independent slate with the backing of many members of the community, members of the town club, members of the women's club, the PTAs, widespread support for him. And he was reelected to the school board. That said, until the 50s, Jews held very few seats on the village board of the school board. No Jewish mayor, no Jewish president of the Board of Ed, president of the town club. This is from the yearbook, The Bandersnatch. To put the attitudes of the time towards Jews in context of about how people felt about everybody, I'd look at these two young women and I'd argue that they were more limited in their life decisions because they were women, not because they were Jewish. So you've got Andrew Shapiro. She was the salutatorian. She went to University of California. Her father was a lawyer in Scarsdale. He specialized in agricultural cooperatives. He's semi-famous because he sued Henry Ford for $1 million for libel. There was just a film about him up at the Jacob Burns Center. There's a new documentary that came out about that. He alleged that Ford's newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, had falsely implicated him in a supposed Jewish conspiracy to rig American agriculture, damaged his reputation. The case ended after Ford shut down his paper, issued a public apology, and a private settlement. So she married, she had kids, she lived in the Bay Area, she was active in the League of Women Voters. But I'm going to guess that a male salutatorian would have, out of Scarsdale High School at that point, would have accomplished more. Marjorie Goldsmith, she was president of the Honor Society of Signifer. She did pretty much everything. This is the parents. The parents were Max and Judith Goldsmith of Upland Farm. She graduated from Wesley, married, she had kids. She actually taught in an Episcopal K-8 school for over 20 years. I saw this in the paper, so I wanted to see whether Why the Chimes Rang was like a Christmas play in the vein of like Rudolph or in Jesus, and it's definitely Jesus. um, a magical church in a distant city houses ancient Christmas bells that ring only for the most meaningful gift to the baby Jesus. So this is Fox Meadow School, and the minister in the play is played by young Arthur Goldstein. Also prominent roles in the cast are Bernard Friedlander, Henry Jacobs, Philip Sonneborn, William Rosenblum, excuse me, and John Weinberg. So it's fair to say that there's still a little blindness about the universality of Christmas. Jewish businesses in Scarsdale. Jews are coming in, not necessarily local Jews, they're opening laundries, pharmacies, tailor shops. This is in the Yiddish Der Morgenjournal, the Morning Journal. Stationery and sporting goods store. This is an ad for somebody to open up. Scarsdale, this is a corner store suitable for a drugstore, for a girl to work on Garth Road in your tailor shop. These are the businesses that I could ascertain were Jewish downtown from a map I have. So I've got Wilson and Sons, probably the first Jewish building. The original name is Boschwitz. We had Arcade Stationery, which was Jewish owned. Parkway Diner, right? This was the Scarsdale Pharmacy. Pharmacies were very much Jewish businesses then. And then we have United Cigar shop over here by, I guess, maybe the guitar shop on East Parkway. This is, you might recognize this. This is a wine shop on the corner of in Heathcote, on the corners, right? Chase Bank is over here. The hair cutter is over here, right? So this was Heathcote Pharmacy over here, right on the corner. You could park right up next to it. Proprietor was David Goldman, Jewish, born 1907 in Hungary, came to New York at 5 years old. Very typical profession for Jews. I really like this picture. It's from Life magazine. And as we close in on World War II, there's some world events that are starting to affect Scarsdale. These are going to contribute to greater sympathy for Jews. Walter Mielziner, he was born in 1921 in Leipzig, Germany. In 1939, he's sent on the Kindertransport to England because things are heating up there. He leaves behind his parents, his two younger sisters. He spends some time in England. Then he winds up sent on to America, and he becomes a gardener on an estate in Tarrytown. So while he's there, he realizes how sporadic and poor his education has been. So he asks around, where's the best school around here? And everybody says Scarsdale. So he comes over, he takes a day off work, he comes to Scarsdale. He speaks to the principal, Lester Nelson. He says, can I enroll here? Nelson is impressed. And he says, yeah, but you need to live here. You need to have a home in the district. And then, of course, you can. So Mielziner goes back to his sponsors, They advertised in the paper, and a Harold D. Fish, who's a zoologist, and his wife, not Jewish, I believe, agreed to host him at their house at 65 Carthage Road in exchange for him doing errands around the house. So he does great at Scarsdale High School. He graduates. He joins the army. He gets educated in electrical engineering and radar. He gets sent back to Europe. The war ends, and he gets permission. He gets a Jeep. He gets a driver, gas, rations, goes into the eastern sector. They go south. They go to Leipzig and to try to find his family. Of course, they find the worst. So this is reported back. This is something that people would know about in Scarsdale. And I think that it can't have helped but humanize things. And then extremely significant is the Children to Palestine campaign. This was a real turning point for Jews in Scarsdale. So this was a Christian-originated interfaith humanitarian campaign to resettle European Jewish orphans into what was then British Palestine, British Mandate Palestine. The British had that from 1917 until the creation of the State of Israel. So they would be educated and cared for, and the Scarsdale chapter was founded by Murray Silverstone, Jewish, who was the president of 20th Century Fox's International Division, and his wife, Dorothy Silverstone, who recruited and formed the local committee. They bring together people of different faiths, including really prominent old guard residents of Scarsdale, and had a particular focus on getting Christian and Jewish youth to work together. And in 1946, they produced this film, Scarsdale in World War II, which you may have seen us show. If you haven't, it's on the Scarsdale Historical Society website, to publicize the cause and to raise money to resettle Jews in British Palestine. They have several benefit screenings. They raise thousands of dollars. One showing raised the equivalent of about $70,000 today. And this is the program, and you see all of the youth working together. And I won't drain this, but you see, Arthur Driscoll, who was the mayor, a Catholic, and then Murray Silverstone, Mrs. Murray Silverstone, all through here. It's Jewish and non-Jewish people working together. So this really does three things, the film and the project. It strengthens sympathy for Jews in the face of persecution. It breaks down social barriers with unprecedented interfaith cooperation, and it demonstrates Jewish civic leadership. And one final example, this is Wilhelm Weinberg. He was a Dutch banker and art collector. He was on a business trip to Paris in 1940 when the Nazis overran Holland. So by luck, he escapes, but his family perishes. They get taken to Auschwitz. He gets out. He gets to Scarsdale eventually. And then he later donated the land, which now the Weinberg Nature Center was built on, in memory of his family. All right, happier stuff. Talk a little bit about Amelie Rothschild. Very significant. She arrived in Scarsdale in the mid-1940s. She became a really significant Jewish civic leader. She joked that her being blonde and blue-eyed led to her being more accepted, but she certainly became respected for really strong intellect, community involvement. 3 years after she arrives in 1947, she becomes the first Jewish president of the League of Women Voters here. The League was generally very good about inclusion. There's always some blind spots. So as she's president, the League is planning to hold its annual meeting at Scarsdale Golf Club. She says, have fun, but if you do it there, I can't attend. And then they realize and they change the location of that. She joined the Women's Club. She reported no prejudice there. She was a member of the Board of Education for 2 terms, second Jewish person after George Ernst, first Jewish woman on the board. She was prominent in the Battle of the Books, which Dan Glauber has talked about, where the board is defending the community and the teachers and the schools against accusations of communist infiltration. And then, so you can get a sense of how sometimes inclusion can be a little bit slow. This is how she was selected to join the board. She says, one Sunday, she and her husband were having drinks and playing games, and the doorbell rings, and 2 men from the nominating committee asked her to step into the den, and they told her that she'd been selected to run for the school board. So she was stunned. She hadn't submitted her name or anything like that. They had just selected her as a really smart person with great judgment. So she obviously had a great reputation for competence, but you can imagine it's a little bit of a closed system that doesn't take new people in, maybe unless they really stand out like she did. So this, I would say you can look at her as a bit of an inflection point between how things were before and really meaningful participation for Jews civically in the post-war era. And this is a little bit of a non sequitur, and I don't know what it means. You can draw your own conclusions because it doesn't mean much for Scarsdale, I don't think. So these are name changes that I found in the Scarsdale Inquirer. So you can't say that they were changing their name for Scarsdale reasons, right? It could have been professional reasons in New York City. So you have Cohen to Collins, Arnstein to Arno, Siegelstein to Siege, Rosenstein to Ross, Goldbaum to Gilborn. That's going like full Gentile. These two are my favorite ones. Max Goldstein and Jack Bursteiner. They are brothers-in-law. They form a candy store in 1928. They expanded to 48 stores, candy, ice cream, and having an Italian name was somehow like for business purposes. And they changed the name of their whole family. But on the other hand, you do start to see in the Inquirer notices for bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah. 1946 is the first bar mitzvah mentioned in the Inquirer. 1955 is the first bat mitzvah mentioned in the Inquirer. So you can't conclude that people weren't proud of being Jewish, telling people that they were Jewish. It was just, this is just a thing. More blindness around Christmas, very interesting. Every children in the Fox Meadows School participated. So, let's see who's there. I'm just looking at the next year to see who's there. There's a lot of Jewish people in there, including Robert Durst, about 3 decades before he starts murdering everybody. I would say Jewish kids dominating the Christmas play. Post-war, Scarsdale becomes pretty Jewish. So this is really amazing. This is based on the work of Dan Glauber, the local history librarian here, and his intern Lily Hope Martinez. They went through the 1950 census, and this is so significant because a lot of other resources that I've looked at try to estimate Jewish people and populations by is it a Jewish name? Right? So like Cohen, yeah, that's probably a Jewish name. Christensen, probably not. Stein, I don't know. So you can't really do that. But what they did is they actually looked at everybody and tried to trace marriage and birth and death and things like that. So they couldn't find everybody, but they found a lot of people and what their affiliation was. I took all of that data, I popped it into a map. Um, Popped maybe is understating how long it took. Um, but for context, U.S. was about 3% Jewish then. New York City was 25% Jewish. Westchester was about 11% Jewish. And Scarsdale, it's about 17% overall Jewish. And where are the Jews? Certainly Fox Meadow, 34% Jewish. Murray Hill, where you could sort of buy your way in, where Harry Rosenthal lived, 38% Jewish, almost 40% Jewish. Amazing. Heathcote, 30%. And then Quaker Ridge, which was just starting to open up then. It's a new place where people can live. There's nobody living there to object. Jews are coming out of the city. 30% West Quaker Ridge, 38% in Quaker Ridge. Where they're not Jews, in the densest parts of town here. Sherbrooke Park, that was restricted, right? I think there was one Jewish person, but they didn't live in Sherbrooke Park. I think they lived up the street and they're just attributed to there. In Crane Berkeley, none of the 44 homes in 1950. So we're 2 years after it being legally, but obviously that practice is going to continue. Old Scarsdale, Bramley Heights, which is basically like north end of Eastchester, none out of the 80 homes Jewish. Arthur Manor, very few. Drake Edgewood, very few. This area is denser, so this does represent more people than a lot of the areas, but super interesting to see because we've never been able to quantify this data before. And if you look there, the Jewish professional fields from the census, a plurality are involved in manufacturing and wholesale. Then you've also got law, finance, and real estate, then some sales and business. And of the manufacturing and wholesale, a lot of them textiles and apparel. This that trend continued literally from the Lower East Side and on up. This was the business. jewelry and diamond, genuine manufacturing, and the wholesale trade. Really interesting. There's still social separation. So you see Lloyd Kahn, Mr. and Mrs. Lloyd Kahn of 172 Fox Meadow Road. They gave a dinner dance at the Glen Island Casino for their 20th wedding anniversary. And just looking at the names, almost all of them, of the invitees are Jewish. So you do see still that separation that I was talking about earlier, civic involvement, but on the weekends or at nights, it's not fully integrated. This is the graduation from 1953. The invocation and benediction were given by Rabbi Lawrence Schwartz of the JCC of White Plains. That really kind of says a lot to have that be, who speaks at your graduation. And many of the names here, and many of them are known to me to be Jewish. And then within a decade, three major Jewish institutions start up. So you've got the first Jewish synagogue in Scarsdale. There have been Jews going up to White Plains, occasionally New Rochelle, but you've got Westchester Reformed Temple. The post-war Jewish influx leads to greater demand, greater need for this. In 1953, 8 Jewish couples meet. Similarly, they met to discuss how to raise their children. And so the pattern matched that. You're going to start off as a religious school or a Sunday school, then it evolved into a congregation once they realized that that wasn't going to sustain anything. Early services were held at the Scarsdale Congregational Church in Dykeman Hall. It grew. They bought land on Mamaroneck Road. They designed this modern star-shaped, it's not a star anymore because it's been renovated, designed by Marcel Brewer. This is a real statement, right? It was dedicated in 1959 with attendance from the mayor of Scarsdale, local Christian clergy, leaders from regional synagogues, really normalizing Jewish institutions. It was led by prominent Rabbi Jack Stern. He pushed things in a very social justice direction. It actually moved, interestingly, from mostly English, highly assimilated practice to becoming more Hebrew and more traditional ritual over time, which is an interesting development. And it grew very, very, very dramatically. You have the JCC of Mid-Westchester, formerly the YMYWHA. This is a really interesting article. They actually started off in Eastchester, across from Eastchester High School. They moved to Wilmot Road in 1969, offering sports and recreation, arts, culture, adult education. Now they serve like 25,000 people a year. But they were offering in 1970, they're offering draft counseling assisted by the American Friends Service, the Quakers, right? The Quakers are pacifists. So they're counseling young men of any faith. You just got your draft notice. What are your options here? Scarsdale Synagogue starts up in 1961. In a very short period of time, you can now have 2 synagogues in town. David Greenberg, broke away from WRT to form this. And by 1968, they built this building on Ogden Road. Not strictly a Jewish institution, but the Golden Horseshoe. It opens in 1957, and you might be wondering, why is it called Golden? Well, before it was remodeled in the current Tudor Revival style, these overhangs were gold anodized aluminum. And then why a horseshoe? 2 reasons. One, it was built on a former racetrack. The other was the original idea was to have it in a horseshoe, but that never happened. So I guess now the name Tudor right angle doesn't have a ring to it, so it's the Golden Horseshoe. But interestingly, it caters to the local Jewish population right from the beginning. So on the left is this restaurant here that serves kosher delicatessen products, including frankfurters, hot pastrami, and corned beef. Super interesting. Then on the right, you have a kosher meat and poultry market, advertised also in a Yiddish newspaper. It says, "A kosher butcher in Scarsdale. The well-known kosher butcher from Crown Heights, Ezra Berkowitz, has opened a fine butcher store in fashionable Scarsdale." And goes on, "Free delivery all over Westchester. Come visit us here." So this was it actually preceded the JCC coming in across the street as kind of a little Jewish hub. Obviously everything wasn't perfect and equal for Jews in Scarsdale, but just to remind you of the context, there were other areas that Jews couldn't even get into at this time. And again, not to keep dunking on Bronxville, but in Commentary magazine in 1959, a journalist goes undercover under the name Harry Greenberg to visit real estate firms in Bronxville. On the way back, we passed the Bronxville Reformed Church, and the real estate agent is talking about, oh, we have this church and we have that church, and he says, we are Jewish. She didn't say another word until we stopped in front of her office. As soon as we parked, she launched into a paean of praise about Scarsdale, 4 or 5 miles north. So it was certainly a known thing. Scarsdale's beauty, its excellent school system, the friendliness of the people. I insisted that my wife wanted Bronxville. And then it really wasn't working. She's saying you wouldn't be comfortable here. She's saying that I wouldn't want you to be hurt. Your children can be really cruel to them. She insisted that I let her call a friend in Scarsdale who would take good care of me and find me a real bargain. And I agreed to look him up. Scarsdale's reputation was already very, very well established as a place where Jews were welcome in the late 50s. To just zigzag back to an event that revealed a lot of social bias in Scarsdale, but eventually refuted it a little bit, there was the incident called the Holly Ball. The Holly Ball is a Christmas debutante dance held at the club. And then in December 1960, a young woman from Scarsdale asked a young man to be her date. So this young man had a Jewish father. He was not raised Jewish. He didn't consider himself Jewish. And in fact, he was baptized as an Episcopalian as a teenager at St. James the Less. The organizers hear about it. They say he's not welcome. The girl says, forget it, we're not coming then. And word gets back to the rector of St. James the Less, George Kempsell. He's completely outraged. He delivers a blistering public sermon. He declares that even Jesus himself would have been barred from the dance. I do like the image of Jesus in a robe and sandals attending a debutante ball in Scarsdale, but he condemns anyone involved in the decision. He says he refuses communion to any congregant who is acquiescent in this happening. And the Inquirer goes off as well. They describe it as an act of cruelty. Then Kempsell takes it to the next level. He goes fully public. After the sermon, he just distributes his sermon to the press. Then the story explodes because then, as now, everybody loves to hear about Scarsdale's foibles, right? So it makes the front page of the New York Times. It's covered by Life, Time, Newsweek, and then Scarsdale becomes this example of exclusionary country club practices. Within a month, Scarsdale Golf Club gets rid of its ban on Jewish guests. Not members, but guests at least. And it started to open up the village's social life. I don't know if any of you are lawyers. They talk about, in the Supreme Court, you talk about good test cases or good plaintiffs. This is an interesting case because the excluded person was a Christian boy, right? And this was a situation that was largely unobjected to for all Jews. But all of a sudden, when it's happening to a Christian boy who has some Jewish heritage to him, now it becomes something that people get kind of upset about. Maybe that's just what it takes, right? To sort of see yourself in other people. This, obviously, it didn't resolve the issue, but it starts to resolve it. And then also to put things in context, in this era, I think there's probably a short list of places in which Jews would feel more welcome. So maybe Great Neck, Long Island, maybe parts of the Main Line in Philadelphia, maybe like Teaneck, New Jersey, but it's not a long list. This is better than most. Dan and Lily Hope are also working on the phone book. So I've got about half of their data for the phone book. So this slide here I made show the change from 1950 to 1960. A lot of Jews are coming in. In the southern part, not a lot of change. Still 0%, 0% in these areas. But Fox Meadow in 10 years has gone from 34% to 59% Jewish. Majority Jewish neighborhood. Green Acres went from 18 to 28%. Murray Hill, Middle Heathcote went from 38% to 56%, majority Jewish part of town. And as you go down into Quaker Ridge, this is the area when Jews are hitting their stride in the US, they're moving out of New York City in large numbers, and you get big areas of land being opened up. So Secor Farm, 62%. West Quaker Ridge, 67. Colonial Acres, it's very small, 78%. Quaker Ridge itself, 95%. Very, very dramatic changes happening in the post-war period. In 1966, Scarsdale schools are closed for the first time for Rosh Hashanah. Note that winter break is called Christmas recess. In New York City, where Jewish students made up 33% of all the students in the city and 45% of the teachers were Jewish, they only started having off for Jewish holidays 6 years earlier. So it's a relatively early adoption. In 1957, members of 6 Scarsdale churches erected, with permission, a nativity scene. This is on Boniface Circle downtown, on public land. And just for the context of the era, a lot of religiosities coming in, Christian America against like godless communism. So you're having more public religious displays. Some of you may recall in 1954 when Under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance. Jews had obviously been used to being in a Christian-centered town, but some feared that this display was sort of meant as claiming a Christian identity in response to rising Jewish population. The village board gave permission every year to have the creche installed for the next 15 years. And then in 1973, Jewish trustee George Zabad abstains. And then in 1976, an ACLU lawyer, Leonard Rubin, he's also a Scarsdale resident, he files suit saying that the creche violates the constitutional separation of church and state. Everybody gets lawyered up. There's Jewish lawyers on both sides, unsurprisingly. And then in 1981, it's pending. And then in 1981, the board does not give permission to put up the creche. So now that committee sues. So now it's fully wound up. It winds up in the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court winds up 4-4, meaning they have to affirm the appellate court's decision, which says that the creche is permissible. You've got 2 competing First Amendment issues. One of them is that the village has to treat public religious displays the same as it treats public secular displays. So if you let things go there for the Junior League or the Boy Scouts or whatever, you can't say that's a church, we won't let it be there. So that's one First Amendment issue. The other one is you don't want the sort of government endorsement of religion. So you've got free speech against the endorsement, both in the same amendment. So this display is allowed as long as it's privately erected and maintained. And then so you see this little sign here to deal with this. This creche has been erected and maintained solely by the Scarsdale Creche Committee, a private organization. So that's how you do it. And menorahs have joined this at various times. We are getting into the mainstream. Scarsdale population starts to level off. Jews are now involved in civic leadership in a much stronger way. Saul Horowitz, he graduates from Phillips Andover Academy, the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He becomes a prominent construction executive with his cousin Richard Ravitch. You know, that name you might know. He was a member of the Scarsdale Board of Ed. Then he becomes a member of the Village Board of Trustees for 2 terms. Then he becomes the first Jewish mayor of Scarsdale from 1969 to 71. Then he gets the Scarsdale Bowl in 73. The Scarsdale Bowl can probably be seen as a good indicator of civic inclusion. It's been awarded since 1943. The first Jewish recipient that I can determine is Samuel Duboff in 1971. And to extend a theme that I've been talking about, this is 4 years before the first woman, Harriet Krantz, got the bowl. From 43 to 70, none of the recipients were Jewish. From 71 to 91, I'd eyeball it at about 1/3. And then from 92 to the present, a majority. What does that mean? It's not about representation, because that's not the right word, because all of these volunteers work for the entire community, and the issues that they work on generally have nothing to do with their identity or religion. What it shows is that it shows, to get this bowl, that you have been working for issues on Scarsdale, and you've been doing a lot, and you've been doing it for a long time. So it sort of is an acknowledgement of that. In this era, we start to have a diversification. We have Orthodox, we have conservative synagogues moving in. The community was mostly Reform for decades. Young Israel, just across Young Israel of Scarsdale, but it's actually in New Rochelle, right across the street on Weaver Street. It's now the largest Orthodox synagogue in Westchester. About 500 families, half of them are from Scarsdale. And then you have Shari Tikva here, conservative. This was built, it was the merger of two synagogues from Tuckahoe and Mount Vernon. The Jewish population is moving up out of those areas, including into Scarsdale. And I'll just note that the names of synagogues, it's really interesting as far as assimilation or embracing of Hebrew. The earlier names, synagogues, have English names, and the later ones have Hebrew names, right? Shari Tikva, Kol Ami, those are the more recent ones. The other ones are just named in English language. One way that Jews have affected Scarsdale is a political shift that correlates with Jews coming in to town. So Scarsdale was heavily, heavily Republican. This is like Scarsdale hated Roosevelt, hated those policies. Presidential candidates in Scarsdale, the Republicans generally outperformed by their national results by 35 points. Crazy, huge thing. So, like in 1936, Roosevelt trounced Alf Landon by 61 to 37, but Landon carried Scarsdale by a 3-1 margin. Right? It's old school Republicanism, okay? Jews are coming in, and this totally erodes. And for the first time in 1964, the Democratic candidate outperforms Scarsdale, Johnson defeating Goldwater, in Scarsdale more than their national average. Really interesting. And then from that point on, a couple little business-minded blips here. Things are in a decidedly Democratic swing. And this is certainly borne out when you look at the local results. So less Jewish parts of town like Edgewood tend to be, or have tended to be, less Democratic. The more Jewish parts of town have tended to be more Democratic. And then just to sort of look at the last little bit I've got here, this kind of puts it all into perspective here. So this is basically the last 80 years. It's not the most recent. This blue line is definitely accurate. So this is the total population of Scarsdale. So you see the boom in the 20s, post-war levels off, and then a boom post-war, and then Scarsdale's population levels off. The non-Jewish population makes up almost all of Scarsdale till about 1920, and then you get a little bit of a delta. You get Jews coming in here. These are more the German Jews coming in. Then you have World War II, and then the huge post-war boom. So the non-Jewish basically reached its peak population of Scarsdale around 1940, and since then has been basically level or declining. So as Quaker Ridge is opening up, almost all those homes are being purchased here by Jewish residents. And if there's any actionable takeaway from this, I would say it's that, the composition of a town is always changing. It's changing now. And so if you look back on the experiences of the Jews who came in the last century, and you look at what I've said, I wish that would have been a little bit smoother for them. Well, there's people moving in right now who you can give the sort of the same inclusion to them because they're going to be, maybe more dominant in the future, or at least, belonging. Everybody should belong, right? So you can kind of think about that as you see the newer demographic entrants to town, treat them as maybe, everybody should be treated. If you're interested in donating to anything, I just put up a couple things of a couple organizations that you can donate to online. Just in the interest of, this was free. I'm happy to do it for free, but if you enjoyed this and you want to pay it forward and you want to help people out in the world, it's a couple of good Jewish organizations, but they do things. It's not Jewish. They're not doing things for Jewish organizations. They're doing things for poverty all around the world. Doing super good work. So you can donate to them or anything that you like. And I also have another thing coming up, the Scarsdale Adult School on April 30th at 11 a.m. That's going to be hosted at Shari Tikva. This is about suburban. I'm going into some things about the shaping of the suburbs in a non-Jewish sense. I'll leave this up, and I don't know if we have a mic. We could turn on the lights. We can look in the chat and see if we have any questions. Thank you.